The candlelight in the assembly room at Ashwick Hall caught everything it was supposed to catch. It caught Lady Fenwick's diamonds. It caught the silk of her gown, the elaborate plasterwork on the ceiling, the glasses of claret arranged on silver trays along the far wall. It caught the faces of every person of consequence in the county, gathered for the midsummer assembly as they had gathered for 30 years, and it made them all beautiful in the way that candlelight makes the prosperous beautiful, which is to say, it softened what the mourning would not. What it could not soften was the young man in livery standing at the edge of the room with a tray. He was tall enough that the tray seemed almost slight in his hands. He stood very still. His coat was black, his stock was white, his expression was exactly what a good footman's expression should be, which is to say, it was nothing at all. He watched the room the way a careful person watches a fire, not for pleasure, but for what it might do. When Sir Aldous Fenwick moved through the crowd and accepted a glass from the tray, the young man bowed. The bow was correct. It was correct in every particular. And yet there was something in it that a woman standing near the door could not quite name. Something that did not belong to the bow at all. Something that lived in the stillness just before the bow began. Miss Cecily Vane had been standing near the door for 20 minutes because there was nowhere else to stand. Her aunt had been absorbed immediately by a group of ladies near the pianoforte, and Cecily had been left with her quiet gray gown and her careful hands, and the knowledge, developed over many years, that she was the kind of woman rooms forgot about. She watched the footman bow. She watched Sir Aldous Fenwick take the glass without looking at the man who offered it. Across the room, Lady Fenwick leaned toward the woman beside her and said something behind her fan. Cecily was too far away to hear it. She would learn the words later, by report. What Lady Fenwick said was this: "The new footman, no family worth mentioning. My husband engaged him as a charity, I believe." The woman beside her made a sound of polite sympathy. The footman's face did not change. He had not heard, or he was very good at the business of not hearing. Cecily looked at his hands on the edge of the tray and thought that he had heard. She did not know his name yet. She did not know that beneath the livery, threaded on a black ribbon against his breastbone, he wore a small brass key. She did not know what the key opened, or what it had cost him to come here, or what 8 years of patience looked like when it finally found the room where it had always been going. She did not know any of it. She only knew that when Sir Aldous Fenwick drained the glass and set it back on the tray without looking, the footman's jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with servitude. This was the 1st of October, in the year 1818, in a county where everyone knew everyone and no one knew this man at all. At least that was what they believed. The Vane family had been solicitors in Ashwick for 3 generations, which meant they were respectable in the way that made certain doors open and others permanently, pleasantly closed. Cecily's father, Mr. Arthur Vane, had been the sort of man who understood other people's affairs with a precision that left him little energy for his own, and he had died 2 years previously, leaving his daughter a mind well furnished with property law and a household debt of £400 that she was still, quietly, paying off. She had come to Fenwick Hall as companion to her widowed aunt, Mrs. Phoebe Alderton, who had been invited for the midsummer fortnight, and who had brought Cecily because she could not bear to travel alone, and because Cecily, as her niece, could be asked without paying her. Cecily did not resent this. She had long since arrived at the particular peace of a woman who has decided not to spend her energy on resentment, and has found that this leaves a great deal of energy for observation. Fenwick Hall was, by any measure, a magnificent house. It sat on 340 acres of the best farmland in the county, its stone facade the warm yellow-gray that English sun and English rain produced together over 2 centuries. Its library the sort of library that made Cecily's chest ache the first time she saw it. Sir Aldous Fenwick had owned it for 11 years, having purchased it, as everyone understood, from the estate of the late Viscount Selborne, whose only son had been abroad with the army and whose affairs had been managed in the son's absence by his father's oldest friend and named trustee, by Sir Aldous Fenwick himself. Cecily had arrived at Fenwick Hall 3 days before the assembly, and in those 3 days she had noticed 3 things. The first was that Mrs. Holt, the housekeeper, was older than the house seemed to need, and had the look of a woman in a place she had served long before its current master arrived. The second was that the new footman moved through the house with a quality of attention that was not quite right for a man who had been here only a month, a quality more like memory than observation, as though he was not learning the corridors, but remembering them. The third was that Mrs. Holt, on the first morning, had set a cup of tea at the footman's place in the servants' hall, with a steadiness of hand that meant she was working very hard not to tremble. Cecily was her father's daughter. She noticed these things. She did not yet know what to do with them. The footman's name, in this house, was Thomas Greer. She had not yet learned his real one. The morning after the assembly, Cecily went to the library. She went because her aunt was sleeping late, and because Fenwick Hall's library was the kind of room that made a woman with £400 of inherited debt feel, briefly, that the world was larger than its ledgers. She went, also, because she had been thinking about the footman since the night before, about the set of his jaw and the quality of his stillness, and because thinking in libraries had always been easier than thinking in the small guest room she shared with her aunt's trunks. She was reaching for a volume on the upper shelf when she heard voices in the corridor. The door was not quite closed. Through the gap, she could see a sliver of the hallway, a side table, a vase of late summer roses, and then the footman, Thomas Greer, with a heavy tray balanced on one arm. He had stopped. Blocking his path was a young man Cecily recognized as Mr. Frederick Fenwick, Sir Aldous' nephew, who had arrived 2 days before from London, and who had the look of a man accustomed to being indulged. "Greer," Mr. Frederick said, in the voice one uses when one has decided the conversation is already over. "Set that down. I need you to ride to Ashwick Village and collect a parcel from the ironmonger. Take the bay." "I am required at the dining room at 1 o'clock, sir," the footman said. His voice was quiet. It was very level. "Then you had better be quick about it. It is now 10:30. Ashwick Village was 4 miles. The bay was not fast. Cecily knew this because she had watched the stables from her window that morning. She also knew, though she could not have explained how she knew it, that Thomas Greer being removed from the hall for 2 hours mattered, that it was not simply an inconvenience, that something was being quietly prevented. She stepped into the corridor. "Mr. Frederick," she said. Both men looked at her. "I am sorry to interrupt. I had asked for Greer's assistance in my aunt's rooms this afternoon. Mrs. Alderton is unwell, and I do not like to manage alone. I hope you can spare him." This was not true. Her aunt was perfectly well and asleep until noon. Mr. Frederick looked at her with the mild displeasure of a man who has been crossed by someone he considered unimportant. "Send one of the maids." "My aunt has expressed a preference," Cecily said, and held his gaze. There was a pause. Mr. Frederick was young enough to be uncertain when certainty did not arrive on schedule, and Cecily had learned, in the 2 years since her father's death, to remain very still when she needed someone to be the first to flinch. He flinched. "Very well," he said, and walked away toward the morning room without another glance at either of them. Cecily turned back to the library. She had taken 2 steps when she heard the footman say behind her, "Miss Vane." She stopped. She did not turn immediately. She was not certain later why she waited the length of a breath. When she turned, he was looking at her with those gray eyes that were entirely too steady for a footman, and his face held something that was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude has a softness to it, and this had none. It was more like recognition, and it was more uncomfortable. "Thank you," he said. That was all. She nodded and went into the library and stood among the books with her heart moving a little faster than she could account for, and the absolute certainty that she had just done something she could not undo and did not want to. The library at dawn was a different country. Cecily had slept badly the way she sometimes slept when something was turning over in her mind, slowly and without resolution, like a stone in a river. She dressed in the gray that she wore for mornings, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and came downstairs at 5:15 with the intention of reading until her thoughts settled. She pushed open the library door. He was there. Not cleaning. Not tending the fire, which was already laid and already burning, as though it had been lit some time ago. He was standing at the long reading table with a book open before him, and his hands flat on the pages on either side of it. And he was reading with the particular quality of concentration that means the person is not merely reading, but studying, absorbing, taking something in, and placing it precisely against other things already known. She recognized the book. She had last seen it on her father's desk. It was Pendleton's property and the entail in the English counties, 3rd edition, and it was not the sort of book a footman read for pleasure. He heard the door. He closed the book and straightened, and his face went to the correct expression, the nothing expression of a good servant. And he said, "Miss Vane, I beg your pardon. I will be out of your way directly." "What were you reading?" The question came out before she had decided to ask it. She watched him consider his options. She watched him, in the pause of 3 or 4 seconds, decide. "Pendleton's work on property law and entail, Miss Vane." She looked at his hands on the cover of the book. She looked at the calluses, which were wrong, not the calluses of a man who had spent his working life lifting trays, but the calluses of a man who had once, a long time ago, ridden hard and worked outdoors and lived differently. She looked at the scar at his temple. She did not understand what she was seeing. Not yet. "It was my father's copy," she said. "He brought it when we came." "I know," he said. And then, quietly, "He has annotations in the margins. Your father wrote very clearly." There was a moment of absolute stillness in the library, the fire the only movement in the room, and Cecily stood very still inside it, and felt the shape of something she could not name, something that had the quality of a key turning in a lock without the door yet opening. "You may keep it," she said at last, "until you are finished." She chose a different volume and sat in the chair nearest the window and opened it to a page she did not read for the next hour. She was aware of him at the table behind her, the soft, intermittent sound of a page turned, and she thought that whoever this man is, he was not who he said he was. She thought of her father and his methods, and she knew what it looked like when a man was building a case. She did not ask him anything further. She understood, without being told, that some things had to be allowed to arrive in their own time. The days that followed settled into a particular rhythm. Cecily read. Her aunt rested and complained pleasantly about the weather. Sir Aldous held small dinners with the county's significant men, at which Edmund served, and Cecily sat at the far end of the table among the wives and daughters who were not interesting enough to be placed near the host, and ate her dinner and watched everything. She watched Edmund carry dishes with the unhurried precision of a man who did not drop things, and she watched Sir Aldous speak over him as though he were furniture, and she watched Lady Fenwick's face when Edmund was near her husband, which was the face of a woman who had decided a thing was safe and had not recently tested the assumption. Mrs. Holt brought Cecily her morning tea each day. On the 5th morning, Cecily said, "How long have you been in service, Mrs. Holt?" The housekeeper set the cup down very precisely in its saucer. "At Selborne, miss, for 22 years. At this house, for 11. "And Greer," Cecily said. "The new footman. Did you know him before he came here?" Mrs. Holt said nothing for a moment that was slightly too long for a woman who had not been asked a difficult question. "I cannot say, miss," she said at last, and left. She could say. She had chosen not to. It was the following evening that Cecily heard them. She had come to the linen closet near the back stairs for a spare candle, and the door to the servants' hall was slightly ajar, and the two voices inside were quiet, but not quiet enough. One was Mrs. Holt's, the other was Edmund's, and in the absence of any listener to perform for, his voice had changed. It was not the careful level nothing of Thomas Greer. It was the voice of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "You have what you need?" Mrs. Holt asked. "The estate ledgers from the first 3 years. A copy of the letter my father dictated in August of 1805. A pause. He knew Fenwick would do this. He did not change the will in time. He did not know how quickly he would go. No. Another pause, longer. I gave Fenwick a year. I signed an extension from Lisbon. I was 22 years old and I trusted my father's friend, and I was wrong to trust him. And everything that followed is the consequence of that error." "Edmund," she said, "I am not reproaching myself, Mrs. Holt. I am simply naming the facts. My father trusted him first. I continued to trust him after my father could not. The will Fenwick filed was not my father's will. The debts that justified the sale were not my father's debts. I have a solicitor who knows the difference between those things and the documents Fenwick produced." A shorter pause now, quieter. "I will not leave this house until it knows my name." Cecily stood very still in the corridor with the candle in her hand and felt her father's voice in her head. The particular tone he used when he explained to her the weight of a man's good name, and she understood now what she had been watching all week, and she understood now what the key beneath his livery opened. And she understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once, and sat in her chest like a coal just beginning to catch, that this man had come here to take back what had been taken from him, that he had lowered himself to bow before his father's betrayer, that he had measured out 8 years of absence and patience against this single autumn, and that every time Sir Aldous Fenwick had set an empty glass back on his tray, Edmund Ashcroft, Viscount Selborne, had stood very still and borne it. She went back upstairs. She did not sleep. If you have stayed with this story to its midpoint, you already feel what Cecily felt standing in that corridor. Stay a little longer. What comes next is not easy, but it is necessary. And it arrives exactly as it should. The letter was found on a Thursday. Lady Fenwick's maid, a sharp-eyed girl named Paget, who had been in that service for 8 years, and who had learned to see the things her mistress wanted seen, had noticed that the footman kept something beneath his livery coat, a small shape against his breastbone that was not a cross, and was not a medallion, but was something sealed. Paget noticed. Paget was thorough. On a Thursday morning when Edmund was called to carry a trunk from a departing guest, she found the coat on its peg in the servants' hall, and she found, in the inner breast pocket, a folded letter. She brought it to Sir Aldous. Cecily heard about it 2 hours later, through Paget herself, who told the other maids at an audible whisper in the corridor outside her aunt's room. "Sir Aldous is in a fury. Paget said, and there was a relish in her voice that made Cecily cold. Says the footman has been playing a long game. Says he is to be turned out this afternoon, before the evening assembly. A footman with no family worth mentioning, and all this time he thought he had a claim. The dismissive label again. The third and final time in this corridor. From this woman's mouth. And what it cost Cecily to hear it spoken about a man she knew now to be its opposite. She went to her room and she sat on the edge of her bed. And she thought very carefully. The letter had been in Edmund's coat. The coat was not with Edmund. Edmund did not know the letter had been found, not yet, and by the time he returned from the East Wing, Sir Aldous would have an hour's advantage. Cecily thought about the solicitor Edmund had mentioned to Mrs. Holt. She thought about the word summoned, and about the word already, and about the difference between a man whose plan had been destroyed and a man whose plan had been discovered before he wished it to be. She put on her Spencer jacket and her plain gloves, and she went downstairs. Edmund was in the back passage when she found him, coat on, the absence against his breastbone visible now as a wrongness, something he knew was gone. He had the stillness of a man who has just received news that he expected, and has not yet decided how to absorb it. He has the letter, she said. He looked at her. A long moment. Yes, he said. Is the solicitor in Ashwick yet? Another pause, different in quality. He arrived this morning. Then it is tonight, Cecily said. It was not a question. He heard that it was not a question. It was always tonight, he said quietly. I only intended to choose the moment. Sir Aldous has chosen it for you. Something shifted in his face, the smallest of movements, like a seam releasing. Yes. He looked at her with those gray eyes that had been steady and contained for as long as she had known him, and in them, for one moment, she saw the man who had written letters from Portugal and trusted too easily and come home to an empty name. I did not intend for you to be involved, Miss Vane. I am already involved, she said. I lied to Mr. Frederick for you. The corner of his mouth moved, very slightly, in something that was not a smile, but was close enough to one that she noticed. You did, he said. Go to the assembly, she said. I will be there. The evening assembly at Ashwick Hall was held in the long room on the ground floor, where the windows faced the south lawn, and the candles were always too many, and the music was always slightly too loud. It was the same room where, 1 month before, Cecily had stood near the door in her gray gown and watched a footman bow. She arrived with her aunt at 7:30. The room was already full. She found Edmund almost immediately, not because he was standing apart, not because there was anything about him that drew the eye in the particular way that power draws the eye, but because she had learned in the last 10 days to find him quickly, the way one learns to find a particular sound in a complicated piece of music. He was near the window. He was not in livery. He wore a coat she had not seen before, charcoal with a silver waistcoat and a white cravat, and the transformation was not what she would have expected, because it was not a transformation at all. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing. He looked exactly the same as he always had, and the coat simply made visible what had always been there. Beside him was a man she did not recognize, perhaps 50 years old, with a leather case under his arm and the particular gravity of a senior solicitor who has made the trip from London because the matter warranted it. Sir Aldous was already across the room, red-faced, with Lady Fenwick at his elbow, and 2 of the county's magistrates within earshot. He had not yet seen Edmund. Then he did. The room did not know it was watching something. The room continued to talk and to drink and to move, because it did not know yet that the thing it had all assembled to witness, the county's year-in and year-out social machinery, was about to be disassembled from the inside. Sir Aldous crossed the floor toward Edmund with the pace of a man who has decided the conversation is his to control. He paused once to lean toward the magistrate at his elbow and say, in a voice that carried, "A footman with no family worth mentioning, making a scene. I had him as a charity case, and nothing more." He was confident. He had been confident for 11 years, and confidence, once established, does not leave room for the possibility that it has been wrong. "Greer," he said. He used the name deliberately. It was the last time he would be able to use it, and he knew it, and so he used it. "You will leave these premises immediately. You have been dismissed." Edmund did not move. "I have not been dismissed," he said. His voice was exactly as it had always been, quiet and level. And the quiet of it in this room, now that the nearest conversations had stilled, was a different kind of quiet than it had been in the servants' hall. It had weight. "You have been found out," Sir Aldous said, and his voice was harder now and louder, because the conversations were stilling around them in a widening circle, the way they do when the room senses something happening and does not want to miss it. "You are a fraud. You came into my household under a false name, and he would not be permitted to remain." "Under a name," Edmund said, still very level, "that I adopted because I required evidence before I made a public accusation. I have it now." He looked at the solicitor beside him. "Mr. Crail has reviewed the documents." Mr. Crail opened the leather case. Sir Aldous said, "Whatever you think you have, it will not hold." "The original will," Edmund said, "dictated by Henry Ashcroft, Viscount Selborne, in August of 1805, witnessed by 2 men who are still alive. You filed a second document dated 3 weeks later, also in my father's name. He was not in Ashwick 3 weeks later. He was in Bath, for his health, where he died 11 days after the date on your document." The room was very still now. Lady Fenwick said, behind her fan, "This is absurd." But the word absurd did not land where she intended it to land, because the room had heard the word Bath, and the word died, and the word document, and was doing the kind of arithmetic that rooms do when they have believed something for 11 years and are beginning to understand what they have believed. Sir Aldous said, in a voice that had lost some of its bottom, "I do not know what you think you can prove." Edmund reached into the breast of his coat, where the small brass key on its black ribbon lived, and he held it out so that it was visible, so that anyone watching could see it. He said, "This is the key to my father's private escritoire at Selborne. The escritoire has not been opened since the sale, because you did not know where to look. It contains the letter my father dictated to your own clerk in the summer of 1805, naming me his heir without condition, without trust arrangement, with the estate passing to me upon his death, with the single provision that I return to England within 3 years of the event. I returned in 2. He turned to face the room. He looked at the faces of the county, which were the same faces he had grown up among, the same faces that had been present at his christening and his mother's funeral and his own departure at the age of 20. The faces that had for 11 years believed they knew the shape of this story. I am Edmund Ashcroft, Viscount Selborne, and Aldous Fenwick holds what is mine. The room held 12 words. No more. He had not needed more. Sir Aldous made one more attempt. You cannot expect anyone to take the word of a footman. He is not a footman, said Mrs. Holt from the side of the room. Nobody had seen her come in. She stood near the doorway in her plain dark dress, with her hands quiet at her sides, and her face as steady as it always was, and every person in the room who had known her for 20 years looked at her, and understood from the way she stood that she had been waiting a long time to say those words. Lady Fenwick's fan went still in her hand. Sir Aldous looked at Mrs. Holt. He looked at the solicitor. He looked at the brass key. He looked, finally, at the room, which was looking back at him with the particular quality of attention that means a crowd has already reached its verdict and is simply waiting for the man in question to accept it. He sat down in the nearest chair. It was not a dignified collapse. It was final. The county's magistrate stepped forward. Cecily stood at the edge of the circle that had formed and watched Edmund speak quietly to the solicitor and then to the magistrates, his voice still level, the brass key still in his hand. And she thought of the morning in the library and his hands on her father's book. And she thought of the corridor outside the servants' hall and the words, "I will not leave this house until it knows my name." And she thought that she had been her father's daughter all her life, and her father had taught her to look at the facts of a case. And the facts of this case were that she had known who Edmund Ashcroft was before he said it aloud, and had helped him without asking anything in return, and was standing here now, watching him reclaim something that was his, and felt, with a fullness that she had not been prepared for, that this was the most important thing she had ever witnessed. He found her, after. The room had rearranged itself, the way rooms do after a thing of consequence has happened. The conversations resuming with a different quality. The faces flushed not with wine, but with the particular energy of people who have been present at a reversal they will discuss for years. Sir Aldous had been escorted from the room. Lady Fenwick sat with her sister, the fan in her lap, her face arranged in the rigid lines of a woman who had not yet decided what her story about this evening was going to be. Edmund moved through the crowd and stopped in front of Cecily. She had expected something formal, something equal to the occasion. What she had not expected was the simplicity of it. The way he stood in front of her without any of the careful performance that had been required of him for a month. Just a man who had arrived somewhere after a long journey. "Cecily," he said. She felt the syllables of her name in his voice as a distinct and deliberate thing, the first time he had used it, the weight of it entirely different from Miss Vane, which had been the correct form, the servant's form. He had chosen her name the way he had chosen everything else this month, with precision and with meaning. "You knew," he said, "at the library." "I suspected," she said, "the hands and my father's book." He was quiet for a moment. Then, in the same level voice, a little lower than it had been across the room, "I did not think anyone would see it. I was careful to be seen as nothing." "You were careful to be seen as nothing," Cecily said, to everyone who was not paying attention. The thing that was almost a smile reached his eyes this time. "Your father's annotations," he said, "are very good." "He was a thorough man," she said. "I know," he said. And there was something in the two words that was not about the book at all, something that named her father as a solicitor who had perhaps known things, and perhaps written things, and perhaps left in his margin notes the beginning of a record that a man building a case might find very useful. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said the rest of it, because they did not need to, because some things can be said in margins, rather than in speech. She reached into her glove and drew out a small folded piece of paper. She had found it that morning tucked inside Pendleton at page 47, where she had seen his hand last rest. It was a note in her father's handwriting, 7 years old. In the margin note abbreviations her father had used for cases he was watching rather than working. The initials AF and a figure, £2,120, and a date, and the word queried. She placed it in his hand. He looked at it, his jaw set in the way she had come to know. "Your father knew," he said, He queried it, she said. He was careful with language. So are you, he said quietly. She was aware of the warmth of the room, the candles and the crowd and the particular quality of the air after something significant, and she was aware of him standing here with her father's note in his hand and the brass key still at his breastbone, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a thing that had been wrong for a long time began to be right. The escritoire is at Selborne, he said. I should like to show you what my father wrote, when this is resolved. If you would come. It was not a dramatic declaration. It had the quality of his commands in the servants' hall, the same directness and the same restraint, and she understood, as she had come to understand all of his speech, that come to Selborne meant a great deal more than the words, and that he was trusting her to hear the more. I will come, she said. The legal proceedings took the autumn. Sir Aldous Fenwick was formally charged before the quarter sessions in November. The original will and the forged document laid before the court, with the testimony of the two surviving witnesses to the authentic instrument, and the evidence of the Bath lodging-house register that established Henry Ashcroft's whereabouts on the date of the forgery. Mr. Crail, who had been building this case in London for 8 months, presented it with the precision of a man who had had a long time to be thorough. The fabricated debts were traced. The proceeds of the sale of Selborne were documented. The court found as it could only find given what was placed before it, and Sir Aldous Fenwick's name, which had sat at the comfortable center of this county's social world for 11 years, was moved to a different kind of record. Edmund did not attend the final hearing. He was at Selborne, which had been returned to him by order of the court in October, and which required the better part of his attention for the first months of its restoration. The chimneys smoked. 3 tenant farms had been badly managed. The gardens had gone to wood and thorn. He was there every morning before the light came fully, and he was there every evening after it left, and Mrs. Holt, who had applied immediately to be reinstated as housekeeper, presided over a household that was slowly, room by room and season by season, becoming itself again. Cecily came in December. Her aunt came with her, nominally. But her aunt found the fireside preferable to the tour, and settled in the morning room with her needlework, and so it was Cecily and Edmund who walked the length of the house, from the entrance hall to the east gallery, to the library that smelled of old paper and damp, and the particular cold of a room that had been closed too long and was slowly remembering warmth. The escritoire stood in the corner of the library where it had always stood. The lid was open. Edmund took the brass key from his waistcoat pocket, where he wore it now. Not on a ribbon against his skin, but in the ordinary way of a man who no longer needed to hide it. He set it on the mantelpiece beside the small portrait of his father, which Mrs. Holt had found in the attic under a dust sheet with the patience of a woman who had kept careful account of where things were moved to. "The letter is there," he said, "if you want to read it." Cecily crossed to the escritoire. The letter was as he had described it, her father's handwriting in the margins, queried and cross-referenced, the same neat abbreviations she had grown up watching. She read it slowly. She was aware of him standing behind her, not close, giving her the distance of a man who has learned when silence is the correct thing to offer. The fire was small, but beginning to find itself. The winter light came through the east window, the particular pale gold of an English December morning that asks nothing, makes no demands, simply arrives and illuminates what is there to be illuminated. "He was going to write to you," she said, when she had read to the end. "There are notes. He was building a case." "I know," Edmund said. "I found his notes in the estate files at the registry. He had filed a query with the Court of Chancery in 1813. It was never followed through. He died in 1814, Cecily said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The fire made a small sound. He would have been glad it is resolved. I believe so, Edmund said. I am glad he had a daughter to carry his methods forward. She turned. He was standing near the window with the winter light behind him, and the portrait of his father on the mantelpiece beside him, and the brass key between them, and he looked at her with the gray eyes that she had read so carefully over the month since October, the eyes that said what his speech left to the margins. I want to show you the East Wing, he said, when you are ready. The gallery above it has a view of the home farm that I think you would like. It was the same quality of speech, the same directness, the same careful offer that said more than it said. She had been her father's daughter long enough to know how to read the document beneath the document, the meaning carried in the structure rather than the words. I would like that, she said. She picked up Pendleton's property law from the shelf beside the escritoire, because it was there and because she liked it, and because it had already proven its usefulness in this particular house. And Edmund watched her do it with something in his face that was entirely, finally, undisguised. And they went together through the connecting door and into the east wing of Selborne, which was his, and which was cold, but which had, in the east window, the particular pale English light that makes every room it enters look like the beginning of something. The brass key stayed on the mantelpiece. The fire caught. If this story has stayed with you, leave the word that comes to mind in the quiet after it. And thank you sincerely for sitting with Edmund and Cecily until they found their way home.